Eleanor Whitfield didn't scream. She didn't cry. She stood in the middle of Whitmore Hall with every eye in Richmond fixed on her, looked down at the engagement ring on her finger, the one Nathaniel Carter had placed there with trembling hands and whispered promises, and she took it off. Slowly, deliberately. She set it on the edge of the silver tray, like it was nothing more than a borrowed hairpin, lifted her chin, and said the 7 words that silenced a ballroom. "Thank you for showing me the truth." If you've ever had someone you trusted completely tear your world apart, stay with me, because this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel. Follow Eleanor's journey all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning of June the 14th, 1816. Eleanor Whitfield woke before the sun. She lay still for a long moment, listening to the birds outside her window, listening to the particular quiet of a house that hadn't quite decided what kind of day it intended to be. The air was thick with summer heat, already Virginia doing what Virginia always did in June, pressing down on everything, like a hand that refused to let go. She had been engaged to Nathaniel Carter for 11 months. She had never once told him she loved him without meaning every syllable. Her dress hung on the wardrobe door, ivory and cream simple, by Richmond standards, elegant by every other measure. She had chosen it herself. Clara had been there when she did, standing beside her in the dressmaker's shop, laughing and saying, "Ellie, you're going to make every woman in that ballroom feel underdressed." Eleanor had laughed too. She thought about that laugh now, lying in the gray morning light. She had known Clara Beaumont since they were 14 years old. 10 years of friendship. 10 years of shared confidences and borrowed shawls and late evenings on Clara's front porch, talking about what their futures might look like. Clara had always been the beautiful one, golden-haired and quick to smile, the kind of woman who drew a room's attention without appearing to try. Eleanor had never resented that. She had been proud of it the way you are proud of something that belongs in some small way to you. She got out of bed. She washed her face and pinned her dark hair and put on the ivory dress, and she told herself that today was going to be the beginning of the rest of her life. She was not wrong about that. She was simply wrong about what kind of beginning it would be. The engagement celebration had been Alexander Whitmore's idea, or rather, it had been arranged at Whitmore Hall, because the Whitmore family hosted every significant social occasion in Richmond without being asked. It was simply understood. The Whitmore name was Old Virginia money and older Virginia influence, and the hall sat at the center of Richmond society, the way a courthouse sits at the center of a town. Not because anyone voted for it, but because everything eventually found its way there. Eleanor had met Alexander Whitmore exactly twice before that evening. The first time she had been 16 and he had been 22, and he had bowed to her mother with the kind of formal courtesy that felt less like manners and more like a wall. The second time had been 3 years ago across a crowded parlor at the Hendersons' winter gathering, and he had said exactly 4 words to her, "Good evening, Miss Whitfield," before someone had pulled him away into a conversation about land disputes along the Eastern Ridge. She had not expected him to be at the celebration tonight. She had not expected much of anything beyond champagne and congratulations, and the particular exhaustion of smiling for 4 hours straight. She arrived at Whitmore Hall at 7:30, with her father at her side, and a feeling in her chest that she could not quite name. Not dread, not quite excitement. Something suspended between the two, the way a breath feels when you're holding it. The hall was already full. Richmond had come out in force. She knew most of the faces. The Hendersons, the Beauchamps, Judge Alcott with his wife on his arm and his opinions already positioned behind his eyes. The Langley sisters, who hadn't spoken to each other in 4 years, but always appeared together in public because social performance required it. And there near the center of the room, Nathaniel, who was laughing at something. His head was thrown back comfortable, easy, the laugh of a man who felt entirely at home in his own life. Eleanor watched him for a moment from across the room and thought, "He looks happy." And then she thought, "I'm glad." She moved to make her way toward him. She stopped, because Clara was standing beside him. That alone was not unusual. Clara and Nathaniel had known each other through Eleanor. They had sat across dinner tables and ridden in the same carriages and attended the same assemblies for nearly a year. It was natural that they would be speaking. But it was not the speaking that stopped Eleanor's feet. It was the hand. Nathaniel's left hand rested at his side, and Clara's fingers were laced through his loose and certain the grip of two people who had held hands before and expected to hold them again. Eleanor's first thought absurdly was, that isn't right. Not as an accusation. As a fact. A simple, rational, clarifying fact. The way you notice a chair placed on the wrong side of a room. Something is wrong here. The arrangement is incorrect. Something needs to be put back where it belongs. Her second thought came slower, like cold water rising. That's why she helped me choose the dress. She stood there long enough for several people to notice her standing. She saw Mrs. Beauchamp's eyes flick toward her, and then quickly away. She saw Judge Alcott's wife lean toward her husband and say something behind her fan. She kept her face very still. Nathaniel turned. He saw her. Something moved through his expression. Relief and guilt, arriving at the same moment, crashing into each other, leaving behind a look that Eleanor recognized immediately, because she had seen it before, on the face of a man who had broken something valuable and was hoping no one had noticed yet. Eleanor. His voice was low. There's something I need to... Don't, she said. The word came out quietly. It came out the way she'd intended, not as a plea, not as a command, but as a boundary. Don't say whatever you've rehearsed. Don't perform regret for this room. Clara had not let go of his hand. Eleanor looked at her, the full weight of it. 10 years of history laid out between them, like a road she had walked confidently for a very long time without ever checking where it led. Ellie, Clara said, and her voice had the texture of something she had prepared. Not cold, almost gentle, which was worse. I know this isn't how. I can see what it is, Eleanor said. A full-length silence pressed into the room. Someone near the doorway had gone very still. Someone else had set down a glass with great care, as though noise would somehow make things worse. Eleanor reached into the small pocket she had asked the dressmaker to sew along the side seam, practical. She had said at the time, a woman should always have somewhere to put her hands, and she withdrew the engagement ring. Nathaniel had given it to her on her mother's front porch in October on a Tuesday evening, when the maples were turning and the air smelled like wood smoke. She had said yes before he finished asking. She had been so certain. She turned the ring in her fingers once. Then she looked at the silver tray on the table beside her, the one holding the empty champagne flutes waiting to be filled for the toast, and she placed the ring on its edge with a small deliberate sound, like a period at the end of a sentence. Thank you, she said, looking at Nathaniel, for showing me the truth before I gave you my future. She did not look at Clara again. She turned toward the exit with her back straight and her hands at her sides, and she did not run. Running would have given Richmond something to talk about for the next decade. Dignity was the only thing they couldn't take from her, and she intended to keep it. She was halfway to the doors when she heard it, one voice not bothering to lower itself. Well. A man's voice. Frederick Langley. She knew it without turning. I suppose some women simply aren't meant to keep a man's interest. A ripple of quiet, polite laughter. Eleanor stopped. She did not turn around yet. She took one breath. It lasted exactly as long as she needed it to. Then she heard something else, footsteps. Slow, unhurried footsteps crossing the polished floor. Not toward her, but toward Frederick Langley, and a voice that Eleanor had heard exactly twice in her life, and never at this volume, never with this particular quality of absolute certainty. Mr. Langley. The laughter died. Mr. Whitmore. Frederick Langley's voice had changed completely. Reduced. I didn't see you. I'm aware that you didn't. Alexander Whitmore did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. That was the thing about a man who owned 3,000 acres and had the ear of every congressman in Virginia. He didn't need volume. Volume was for men who were afraid they weren't being heard. I'd like to know what you meant by that remark. It was only, I know what it was. A pause. Not a casual pause, a deliberate one. The kind of pause a man uses when he wants the room to understand that he is choosing his next words with complete intention. Miss Whitfield displayed more dignity in the last 5 minutes than you have displayed in the entirety of your adult life. I'll thank you to remember that, before you speak again." The room had gone the kind of silent that Richmond society would still be talking about in the winter. Eleanor had not moved. She turned around. Alexander Whitmore was standing 8 feet away from Frederick Langley, his posture exactly the same as it always was. Spine straight. Jaw set, the kind of stillness that comes not from restraint, but from the absolute absence of the need to prove anything. He was not looking at Langley anymore. He was looking at her. His eyes were dark brown, steady, and held no pity in them whatsoever. That was the first thing she noticed. No pity. Not performance. Not the careful social sympathy of a man managing a delicate situation. He was looking at her the way you look at something you've just understood for the first time. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her. He was tall, taller than she remembered, and the candlelight caught the silver at his temples and the careful cut of his dark coat. "Miss Whitfield," he said. "Mr. Whitmore." Her voice did not shake. She was proud of that. She was extraordinarily proud of that, because the inside of her chest felt like it was made of broken glass, and the fact that none of that was showing was perhaps the greatest performance of her life. "I wonder," he said, "if you would honor me with a dance." The room breathed in. Not a waltz, not a formal set piece. A single dance asked for in the immediate aftermath of the most public humiliation Richmond had witnessed in years by a man who could have spent that evening anywhere else and chosen deliberately to spend it here. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "I'm not certain," she said, "that I'm in the mood for dancing, Mr. Whitmore." Something shifted in his face. Not disappointment, respect. The slight recalibration of a man who has received an honest answer and finds he prefers it to a polite one. "Fair enough," he said. "Then perhaps you'd allow me to walk you to the terrace. The air is better there." "The air," she said carefully, "or the distance from this room?" "Both," he said. "I won't pretend otherwise." She went with him. Later she would think about that, why she went. It was not because she was grateful. It was not because she was overwhelmed. She went because he had said, "I won't pretend otherwise," and in the space of 30 minutes she had received more dishonesty than she had experienced in 11 months, and the simple fact of a man who would not pretend felt in that moment like water in a drought. The terrace ran the length of the east wing. The summer air hit them when they stepped through the doors, thick and warm and smelling of cut grass and honeysuckle, the particular sweetness of a Virginia June evening that always felt like it was promising something. Eleanor walked to the stone railing and rested her hands on it and looked out at the dark lawn. "You don't have to stay," she said. "You've made your point to the room. I'm not making a point." He stopped a few feet away, not close enough to be improper, not far enough to be dismissive. "I'm standing on my own terrace because it's a warm evening. And the coincidence of my presence isn't a coincidence," he said. "But I'm not going to apologize for that either." She turned to look at him. I was not performing. That was the thing she kept returning to. Every man she had dealt with tonight had been performing something: Nathaniel's guilt, Frederick Langley's casual cruelty, the room's collective hunger for spectacle. Alexander Whitmore appeared to have nothing to perform. "Why did you intervene?" she asked. "With Langley?" "Because what he said was wrong. Men say wrong things at parties every evening in Richmond. You don't generally correct them." "No," he agreed. "I don't." "Then why tonight?" He considered her question with the kind of seriousness that suggested he was actually thinking about it, rather than reaching for a prepared answer. "Because you handled something that would have destroyed most people," he said, "with more steadiness than I've seen from men twice your age, facing stakes that didn't touch their hearts half as deeply. And Langley was about to let you walk out of this room carrying his interpretation of it. I wasn't willing to let that stand." Eleanor looked at him. "You don't know me," she said. "No," he said. "I know what I watched." The honeysuckle moved in the warm air. Somewhere inside, someone had started the music again, the party finding its feet, the way parties always did, regardless of what had happened within them. "I'd like to know you," Alexander Whitmore said. "If you're willing, when you're ready." "I don't need rescuing, Mr. Whitmore." "I didn't offer any." His voice was even. "I offered an introduction." She left Whitmore Hall that night in her father's carriage, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the road. Her father, a quiet man, a careful man, a man who had navigated life's hardships by maintaining an absolute stillness around all feelings that threatened to be too large, sat across from her and said nothing for a long while. Then he said, "Eleanor." "I'm all right, Papa." "I know you are." He paused. "That's not what I was going to say." She looked at him. "I was going to say that I have never been more proud of you in my life." His voice was rough around the edges, the roughness of a man who didn't come easily to sentiment. Not once. Not in 24 years. Eleanor turned her face to the window. She allowed herself in the privacy of the dark carriage, with no one watching, exactly 3 tears. Then she stopped. She was not finished. She didn't know yet what she was beginning, but she knew with the particular certainty that had always been the center of her character, steady and unapologetic and unconditional. That whatever came next, it was not going to be the story Frederick Langley told. She was going to make sure of that herself. The next morning, Richmond decided what it thought. By 10 o'clock, 3 separate accounts of the evening were circulating across the parlors and drawing rooms of Virginia's social set, and Eleanor had heard pieces of all 3 before noon. The first, she caused a scene. The second, she was humiliated. The third, this one quieter, carried in lower voices, traded with more uncertainty. Alexander Whitmore dressed down Frederick Langley on her behalf. He asked her to dance. She turned him down. It was the third one that gave the first 2 pause. Mrs. Beauchamp stopped by the Whitfield house at 11:30, under the guise of checking on Eleanor's welfare. She sat in the front parlor and drank the tea Eleanor's mother offered, and said with great, carefully managed innocence, "I suppose you'll be withdrawing from the season." Eleanor, seated across from her with her tea untouched, said, "Why would I do that?" Mrs. Beauchamp blinked. "Well, given the circumstances." "The circumstances," Eleanor said, "are that I returned a ring that no longer belonged where it had been placed. That seems to me a reasonable and practical action, not a reason to disappear from my own life." "Of course," Mrs. Beauchamp said. Her eyes were doing calculations. "Of course." "I'll be at the Alcott gathering on Thursday," Eleanor said. "I hope to see you there." She meant it as a statement of fact. Richmond received it as a declaration of war. She had not expected Alexander Whitmore to call the following morning. She had not expected him at all, which was perhaps why she was in the kitchen, helping Mrs. Holt, their housekeeper, a compact woman of 50, who had kept the Whitfield house running with the efficiency of a military campaign for 15 years, sort through the estate's accounts when the knock came. Miss Whitfield. His hat was in his hands. He had come alone, no carriage, no footman, the way a man comes when he doesn't want to make a statement about the fact that he's coming. "I hope I'm not intruding." "You are," she said honestly, "but I'm going to invite you in anyway." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The structural suggestion of one. He sat across from her in the front parlor. The same parlor Mrs. Beauchamp had occupied the day before, though it felt entirely different with him in it. And he said, without any of the careful social scaffolding that most conversations required, "I'd like to make you a proposal." "Of business," she said immediately. "Of business." He confirmed with what she thought might have been the faintest edge of amusement. "I've been looking for someone to assist with the management of the Eastern parcel accounts. 300 acres along the Ridge Tenant Farmers, a mill that needs restructuring. I've been told your father's finances were managed primarily by you for the last 4 years. "Who told you that?" "Your father. When I stopped by this morning to ask his permission to call on you." Eleanor went very still. "You spoke to my father." "I did. Before coming here." "It seemed appropriate." She studied him. "Most men in your position don't consult fathers before approaching women for business arrangements." "Most men in my position," he said, "aren't approaching this particular woman." The room was warm. The summer heat pressed against the windows. "What exactly did you say to my father?" she asked. "I said I was interested in consulting his daughter on a business matter, and that I wanted to be certain the approach was made respectfully." He paused. "He seemed relieved that someone was treating you like a person with professional value rather than a social casualty. A social casualty. The phrase landed somewhere that Eleanor wasn't fully ready to examine. "And if I'm not interested," she said, "then I'll wish you a good morning and let myself out." He said it simply. No pressure in it. No performance. "This isn't a rescue, Miss Whitfield. I have accounts that need managing by someone with a clear head and sound instincts. What I watched 2 nights ago suggested you have both. That's the whole of it." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the accounts spread across her kitchen table. She thought about her father's estate, which was not in trouble, but which required careful watching. The way anything of moderate size requires careful watching when the world is not particularly inclined to be kind to women who manage things on their own. She thought about Mrs. Beauchamp's careful eyes, and Frederick Langley's laughing voice, and the 11 months she had spent building a future around a man who had apparently been building a different one. "Tell me about the mill," she said. His expression did not change, but something behind it shifted the slight, contained movement of a man who has been surprised and is deciding whether to show it. "The millstone needs replacing," he said. "The tenant contracts haven't been renegotiated since my father held the title. There's a water rights dispute with the neighboring property that needs documentation and legal review." The neighboring property, owned by Thomas Alcott, Judge Alcott's son. The same. Eleanor picked up the pen from the writing table beside her. Old habit, something to hold when she was thinking. "The water rights dispute," she said. "Is it documented anywhere? Letters, original deed language, survey records." Something in his jaw shifted. "There are survey records from 1802 that may be relevant. I haven't had the time to have them properly reviewed." "I'd like to see them," she said. He looked at her. "Before I agree to anything," she said, "I want to understand what I'd actually be working with. I don't take on arrangements without understanding the full scope of them." She paused. "You should know that about me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll have the records sent over this afternoon." "Thank you." She set the pen down. "I'll review them and we can speak again on Thursday." "Thursday," he said. "After the Alcott gathering." His expression did not shift, but she had the distinct impression that he understood exactly what she was doing and that he approved of it. He stood. He picked up his hat. He moved toward the door, and then he stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back. "Miss Whitfield." "Mr. Whitmore, for what it's worth." He said it carefully, like a man who didn't say things he didn't mean, and was aware that the line between meaning something and being misread was very narrow. "The room had the wrong story last night. I wanted you to know that someone in it had the right one." He was gone before she could answer. Eleanor sat in the parlor for a long moment with the pen in her hand, and the survey records not yet arrived, and 11 months of wrong choices beginning slowly to settle into the shape of something she could actually use. She picked up the pen. She went back to the accounts. She had a great deal of work to do. The survey records arrived at 4 o'clock that same afternoon, carried by a young man in Whitmore livery, who handed them to Mrs. Holt without ceremony and left before Eleanor had finished washing the ink from her hands. She spread them across the kitchen table. They were old. The paper had the particular brittleness of documents that had been folded and unfolded too many times. The edges soft with handling, the ink faded in the corners where light had done its patient work. The survey from 1802 was drawn in a careful hand. The property lines marked with a precision that spoke of a surveyor who understood that lines on paper became arguments in courtrooms. Eleanor traced the creek boundary with one finger and felt the shape of the dispute take form in her mind before she had read the accompanying letters. Thomas Alcott's claim rested on a secondary survey conducted in 1809. The 1809 survey used a different baseline. She read it twice to be certain she was right. Then she read it a third time because certainty in her experience was worth the extra 5 minutes it took to earn it. She was right. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her and began writing her notes. Her father appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6:30 and looked at the spread of documents and the cold cup of tea at her elbow, and the 3 pages of notes she had already filled, and said with the careful understatement of a man who has learned not to startle things in motion, Dinner's been ready for an hour. I know. She didn't look up. Papa, did you know that the Whitmore Eastern Parcel Survey and the Alcott Survey use different reference points for the creek boundary? I was quiet for a moment. I did not. If you were a judge looking at this dispute, which survey would you consider authoritative? He came into the kitchen and sat down across from her and looked at the documents with the eyes of a man who had spent 30 years watching Virginia courts handle land disputes. The earlier one, he said slowly, generally, unless the later one could be shown to have been commissioned with the intent to establish a different claim. She tapped the 1809 document. This surveyor James Alcott. Any relation? Her father's eyebrows rose. He picked up the paper. He read the name again. Thomas Alcott's cousin, he said. Eleanor leaned back in her chair. Well, she said. Her father set the paper down. He looked at her across the table with an expression she recognized, the same expression he had worn the first time she had balanced the estate accounts without a single error at the age of 17. Pride and something else, something quieter, something that looked a great deal like relief. Alexander Whitmore is a careful man, her father said. He is, Eleanor agreed. He didn't come here this morning just because of the accounts. Papa, I'm not suggesting anything improper. He held up a hand. I'm saying that careful men don't make unnecessary visits. He came to look at you the way a man looks at a thing he's trying to understand. He paused. I told him you were not a woman who could be managed. Eleanor looked up. What did he say? He said he wasn't looking for someone to manage. Her father rose from the chair. He said he was looking for someone to trust. He moved toward the door. Dinner's getting cold, Eleanor. She looked at the survey records for another moment. Then she gathered them into a neat stack, capped the ink, and went to dinner. Thursday came with the particular weight of things that have been anticipated too long. Eleanor dressed without ceremony, a blue walking dress plain at the collar, appropriate for a morning gathering at the Alcotts. She had received 2 calls since the night of the engagement celebration, and declined both on the grounds of prior engagement, which was technically true and socially devastating to the callers, who had come hoping to extract details and left with nothing. She arrived at the Alcott house precisely on time. The gathering was already in full arrangement. The Alcotts kept a formal morning room that functioned in practice as Richmond's secondary court of public opinion, a place where the verdicts delivered in parlors were ratified or overturned, depending on who controlled the conversation. Eleanor walked in with her chin level and her hands at her sides, and felt the room notice her the way a room notices a change in weather. Mrs. Alcott. Margaret, a woman of 60, who had survived 3 Richmond social scandals of her own and emerged from all of them with her dignity intact by the simple method of refusing to acknowledge that they had occurred, crossed to Eleanor immediately. My dear. She took Eleanor's hands. Her grip was firm and deliberate. I'm glad you came. I told you I would, Eleanor said. Yes, you did. Margaret Alcott studied her for a moment with the eyes of a woman who had learned to read people the way pilots read weather. Good girl, she said softly, which was not condescending coming from Margaret, because Margaret said it the way generals say, well done, as assessment, not diminishment. She was seated. Tea was brought. The room began its slow rotation around her. The first to approach was James Whitfield. No relation, a merchant of 50 who had done business with her father for years and who navigated awkward situations by addressing them head-on and loudly, and then moving past them so quickly that everyone felt slightly exhausted. Dreadful business the other night, he said, pulling up a chair. You handled it well. What are you doing next? Eleanor blinked. She had prepared herself for sympathy and for cruelty, and for the particular misery of polite pretense. But she had not prepared herself for James Whitfield simply asking what she was doing next, as though the evening at Whitmore Hall had been a setback in a business arrangement, rather than the public destruction of her romantic future. I'm reviewing some land survey documents, she said honestly. Whose? The Whitmore Eastern Parcel. James Whitfield's eyebrows went up. Then he leaned forward with the expression of a man who has just become very interested. Alexander Whitmore asked you to look at those accounts. He did. He sat back. Something was moving behind his eyes, rapid and assessing, and not unkind. "Smart man," he said finally. "Those records have been a mess since his father died. 3 different solicitors have looked at them, and none of them understood the creek boundary situation." He looked at her. "Do you?" "I believe so," she said. "There's a discrepancy in the baseline reference between the 1802 and the 1809 surveys. The 1809 surveyor shares a surname with the party making the competing claim." James Whitfield stared at her. Then he laughed, not mockingly, genuinely, the laugh of a man who has received an unexpected and satisfying answer. "Well," he said, "Thomas Alcott is not going to enjoy your involvement." "No," Eleanor agreed. "I don't imagine he will." Whitfield left her with a nod that contained, she thought, more respect than she had received from most people in the last 48 hours, which was either a reflection of his character or a very low bar for the room. Possibly both. The morning continued. 3 women approached her with varying degrees of theatrical sympathy, and she received all of them with courtesy and revealed nothing. She watched. She listened. She catalogued. Nathaniel and Clara were not present, which meant one of 2 things either. They had chosen to avoid the gathering deliberately, which was cowardly, or they had not been invited, which was Margaret Alcott making a point. Eleanor suspected the latter. She was almost certain of it when Margaret appeared at her elbow at 11:30 and said conversationally, as though commenting on the weather, "I heard Frederick Langley is claiming his remark the other night was misunderstood." "Is he?" Eleanor said. "He says Alexander took it out of context." A pause. "Alexander disagrees with this interpretation." Eleanor kept her face still. Mr. Whitmore expressed his view fairly clearly. "He did." Margaret sipped her tea. "You know Alexander doesn't do things without reason." "So I'm beginning to understand. He's been alone a long time." Margaret said it with the particular precision of a woman who means something exact and wants to make sure it lands correctly. "Not lonely, alone. There's a difference. His wife died 8 years ago. He's been—" She paused, choosing. "Contained. Careful. The way men get when they've decided that caring about something is a liability they can't afford." Eleanor was quiet. "I'm not telling you this to push you toward anything," Margaret said. "I'm telling you because you deserve accurate information, and most people in this room are going to give you the decorated version." She set down her cup. "He's not an easy man, but he's an honest one. In my experience, those 2 things tend to come together." "Thank you," Eleanor said. And she meant it. She was putting on her coat to leave when the room shifted. She felt it before she saw it, the particular change in air pressure that occurs when someone important enters a space, not because they announce themselves, but because they don't have to. Alexander Whitmore had arrived. How was with James Whitfield, apparently having met him on the front steps, and they were talking about something with the ease of men who have conducted serious business together for years. Alexander had not yet looked across the room. He was listening to something Whitfield was saying. His head slightly inclined, the posture of a man who actually listens, rather than waiting for his turn to speak. Then he looked up. He found her immediately. Across the full length of the morning room, through the drift of conversations and the bodies of 30 people. His eyes went to her as though he had known exactly where she was. He excused himself from Whitfield and crossed toward her. "Miss Whitfield." "Mr. Whitmore." "Did the records arrive?" "They did, yesterday afternoon." She adjusted her coat. "I have notes if you'd like to discuss them." "I would." He glanced around the room, which was watching their exchange with the concentrated attention of people who understood they were witnessing something they would be discussing for weeks. "Perhaps not here." "No," she agreed. "Not here." A pause. "There's a matter I need to raise first," she said, "before we discuss the survey records." Something in his expression sharpened. Not alarm, attention. "Go on. I want to understand what you're actually proposing." She kept her voice low and even. "Not the business arrangement, I understand the terms of that. I mean what you're proposing by being seen here, with me, publicly, now." She met his eyes directly. Because Richmond is watching every conversation you have with me and drawing conclusions, and I need to know whether those conclusions are going to create problems for the work." He was quiet for a moment. "They won't," he said. "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. Something moved through his expression, the slight careful recalibration of a man confronted with a question that is more intelligent than the one he expected. "I'm aware of what Richmond is watching," he said. "I'm not concerned by it." "I am," she said. "My reputation is already in an interesting position. I need to understand whether your involvement makes it more stable or less." Howe was quiet for long enough that she began to think she had miscalculated, pushed too hard, too directly, too soon. Then he said, more stable, unambiguously, "My involvement publicly makes your position in this community substantially more secure, not less." A pause. "That's not the reason I'm here, but it's the honest answer to your honest question." Eleanor looked at him. "All right," she said. "All right," he repeated. "Thursday next, my father's study. Bring the original deed language for the eastern parcel." "I'll be there at 10. She nodded. She moved toward the door. She was 3 steps away when his voice came behind her, quiet, not performing anything for the room. "Miss Whitfield." She turned. "You were right about the surveyor," he said. "James Alcott. I should have caught it 2 years ago." Eleanor considered that for a moment. A man who could have said nothing, who had every social reason to let her believe she had discovered something he didn't already know, was instead telling her that he had missed it. "Yes," she said simply. "You should have." She left. Behind her, she was fairly sure she heard James Whitfield laugh. The following 2 weeks moved with a speed she had not anticipated. She met with Alexander 3 times, twice at her father's house, and once at the edge of the eastern parcel itself, where she walked the creek boundary in her good boots and ruined the hem of her dress in the summer mud, and did not apologize for either of those things. He didn't expect her to. The work was real. That was the first thing she understood. This was not a performance of professional collaboration. It was actual, demanding, frequently frustrating work, involving records that hadn't been properly cross-referenced in a decade, tenant agreements, written with the deliberate vagueness of men who expected disputes to be settled by force of personality rather than documentation, and a water rights situation that would require a formal legal hearing regardless of how well she organized the evidence. She was good at it. She had always known she was good at it. She had managed her father's estate with the same quiet competence she brought to everything, steadily, without fanfare. The way women who are good at things often work when the world is not particularly interested in acknowledging the fact. But working within the Whitmore accounts was a different scale entirely. 3,000 acres. Multiple tenants. Business arrangements extending into Philadelphia and Boston. A mill that had been underperforming for 4 years because nobody had bothered to ask why. She asked why. The answer, when she found it, was so straightforward and so long overlooked that she sat in Alexander's study for a full minute before she said anything. He was watching her across the desk. "The millstone," she said finally. "What about it?" "It's not the millstone." She turned the ledger toward him and pointed to a column entry from 2 years prior. "It's the water wheel rotation. Someone changed the gear ratio in 1814, and nobody adjusted the grinding pressure to compensate. The mill has been working at 70% capacity because the mechanism is out of alignment, not because the stone is worn." He stared at the ledger. "That," he said, "is a 2-day repair. Probably less with the right man." She turned the ledger back. "You've been losing revenue on that mill for 2 years over something a competent millwright could have identified in an afternoon." He was quiet. "I'll admit," he said, "that I hired 3 different people to look at those accounts before you. And none of them caught it. None of them caught it." She didn't say I did. She didn't need to. It was sitting in the room between them, plain and undeniable, and he knew it. "I'll contact the millwright in the morning," he said. "There's a man in the lower district, Josiah Hale. He worked on the Henderson Mill in 1812. He'll understand the mechanism." Alexander wrote the name down without being asked. She watched his hand move across the paper. He had not once in 3 meetings treated her the way the men of Richmond typically treated women who offered information with the particular patience of someone managing an enthusiastic child. He asked follow-up questions. He pushed back when he disagreed. He changed his position when she demonstrated he was wrong without fanfare, without the elaborate performance of graciousness that men sometimes produced when they wanted credit for conceding to a woman. He simply changed his position and moved on. She was discovering the most rare quality she had ever encountered in a person. She was also discovering with the careful attention she brought to everything she didn't fully understand, yet that the mill and the survey records and the tenant agreements were not the only thing she was learning. She was learning him. Clara Beaumont sent a letter on the 3rd week. It arrived on a Thursday morning. A Tuesday would have been less formal. A Sunday more carefully considered a Thursday, suggesting something written in a moment of sudden decision and sent before the decision could be reconsidered. Eleanor recognized the handwriting on the envelope and held it for a long moment before she opened it. Ellie, I know you don't want to hear from me. I know I don't deserve to be writing this. I'm writing it anyway because I've been a coward about everything else, and I refuse to be a coward about this too. What I did was wrong. Not because of what society says. Because of what we were to each other. You were the truest friend I ever had, and I repaid that with the worst possible betrayal, and I've known it every day since, and knowing it hasn't been nearly as painful as it should be, and that frightens me. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I understand if that isn't something you can give. I'm asking only that you know I am not as simple as what I did. I don't know if that matters to you. I suppose I'm writing this because somewhere inside me, I still believe it matters to you, because you were always the person who understood that people are more complicated than their worst moment. I may be wrong. I may be exactly as simple as what I did. I don't know what Nathaniel and I are building. I know I am beginning to suspect I didn't think clearly enough about whether I wanted what I reached for, only about the reaching itself. I'm sorry, Ellie. For whatever that is worth from someone who doesn't deserve to offer it. Clara Eleanor read it twice. She folded it. She put it in the drawer of the writing table. She sat for a long moment with her hands flat on the surface of the desk. Then she pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began drafting the formal complaint regarding the 1809 survey, because there was work to be done, and feelings could wait their turn. She would answer the letter. Not today. Perhaps not for a while. But she would answer it because Clara was right about one thing Eleanor had always understood, that people were more complicated than their worst moment. The understanding didn't fix what was broken. It didn't make the hand-holding at Whitmore Hall something that could be unseen. But it meant that somewhere beneath the anger which was real, and which she allowed herself to feel fully in the privacy of her own mind, there was the memory of 10 years of genuine friendship, and she was not willing to pretend that memory was simple either. She wrote the survey complaint with a clean hand and a clear head. That afternoon, she sent it to Margaret Alcott's nephew, who was a solicitor in Richmond, with a reputation for taking land cases that established families would rather avoid. She did not tell Alexander she had done it. He found out anyway. He arrived at her father's house the following morning without sending a card ahead. Mrs. Holt showed him into the front parlor, and Eleanor came downstairs to find him standing at the window with the survey complaint in his hand. Her draft, she realized immediately, which she had left on the writing table the previous afternoon, and which Mrs. Holt had apparently shown him without understanding that it was not yet meant to be shared. She stopped in the doorway. He turned. "You filed this," he said. "Not an accusation. Not quite. I sent a draft to William Alcott, Margaret's nephew. He'll review it and will revise before it's formally filed." She came into the room. "I intended to tell you. When I had William's assessment." She met his eyes. "I didn't want to raise the possibility without knowing whether the legal basis was strong enough to pursue. It is. He confirmed it yesterday evening." Alexander looked at the document in his hand. Then he looked at her. "You did this," he said slowly, "before we had formally agreed on the scope of your involvement in the legal matter." "Yes." "Without telling me." "Yes." A pause. "Why?" She considered the question seriously the way he deserved. "Because in my experience," she said, "when a woman comes to a man with an idea, the idea gets questioned first. But when she comes with the idea fully formed and the preliminary work already done, it gets considered. She paused. I wanted it considered. The room held still. He set the document down on the side table. William Alcott is the right choice, he said. He's argued 3 boundary cases in the last decade and won 2 of them. He paused. You already knew that. I asked Margaret. Of course you did. Something moved in his voice, not irritation. The opposite. A quality she was beginning to recognize, the particular sound of a man who has been surprised by something and finds the surprise unexpectedly welcome. He crossed to the chair across from her and sat, and the formality of the room dropped slightly the way it does when 2 people stop performing for each other and simply begin talking. Tell me what Alcott said about the 1802 baseline. She sat. She told him. They talked for 2 hours. Not as employer and consultant. Not as social acquaintances navigating the careful choreography of Richmond propriety. They talked the way Eleanor had always believed 2 people could talk, directly with disagreement and concession, and the full engagement of 2 minds that were not identical and did not need to be. He pushed back on her reading of the Eastern tenant contracts. She held her ground and showed him 3 separate precedents. He reconsidered. She found somewhere around the 2nd hour that she had stopped tracking the conversation for the purpose of the work and had started simply listening. The cadence of his thinking. The points at which his certainty arrived and the points at which it paused. The way he said I was wrong about that, without any architecture around it. No softening, no rerouting, just the plain statement and then the correction. She had not known until this moment how much she had needed to meet someone who did that. She didn't examine the thought. She noted it the way she noted entries in the ledger, accurately without interpretation, and filed it away. They were nearly finished when the parlor door opened. Her father appeared, which was unusual enough at this hour that both Eleanor and Alexander turned. Her father had the look of a man carrying news he had not yet decided how to deliver, which was unusual because her father was not a man who delayed delivery of things. I'm sorry to interrupt, he said. He was looking at Eleanor. There's a matter I thought you should know. Papa, Nathaniel Carter has made an offer on the Henderson parcel. He said it plainly, the way he said everything. He's proposing to use the Beaumont family backing for the purchase. Clara Beaumont's father has apparently agreed to extend credit against his textile interests. The room was completely still. Eleanor processed this. The Henderson parcel shared a boundary with the Whitfield estate, not adjacently, but at the eastern corner, where the old Miller's Road ran. It was not a threatening position. It was not in any obvious way a problem. But the fact of Nathaniel Carter positioned on the boundary of her family's land, backed by Clara Beaumont's father's money, with all the social implications that arrangement carried. He's placing himself near your family's property, Alexander said. Not a question. Apparently. Her voice was even. Does that concern you? She thought about it honestly. Not for the reasons it might have a month ago, she said. Nathaniel is not strategic enough to have planned this deliberately. He's opportunistic. The Henderson parcel came available, and he reached for it. She paused. What concerns me is that Mr. Beaumont's textile credit is extended further than most people realize. I've seen the Richmond exchange reports. If he's backing a land purchase of this size, he's overextended. Both men were looking at her. I'm not saying this as something that benefits me, she said carefully. I'm saying it because an overextended purchase on a neighboring boundary has legal implications for property rights along Miller's Road, and we should document our position before the Alcott water rights hearing. She looked at Alexander. Can you have William review the Miller's Road boundary language? He was quiet for a moment. I'll contact him today, he said. Her father excused himself with the quiet tact of a man who understood that the conversation in the room was doing something important and did not need him in it. Alexander remained. He was looking at her with the expression she had begun to recognize. Not quite an assessment, not quite something else, something between the two that she did not yet have a word for. Miss Whitfield. Mr. Whitmore, are you all right? He asked it the way he did everything, directly, without decoration. Not how are you feeling, or the elaborate social circumlocution that meant the same thing. Just, "Are you all right?" She thought about the letter in her drawer. She thought about Nathaniel's hand reaching for a Henderson parcel he probably couldn't afford. She thought about Clara's apology, which had been real, even if insufficient. She thought about 11 months of a life she had believed she was building, and the strange clarifying violence of watching it come apart in a ballroom. "Yes," she said. And then, because he had been honest with her consistently enough that she felt she owed him the same, not entirely, but mostly. He nodded. "That seems about right," he said. "For the circumstances." "You said your wife died," she said. She had not planned to say it, but it came out with the directness that tended to emerge between them when the formal scaffolding of the conversation had dropped. 8 years ago. He went very still, not uncomfortable, not defensive. The stillness of a man who has been asked a real question and is deciding whether to give a real answer. "Yes," he said. "Were you all right after?" A long pause. "No," he said. "Not for a long time." He looked at the window for a moment, then back at her. "I became very good at the work. That helped." Eleanor looked at him. "Yes," she said quietly. "It does." The room held them both in the particular stillness of two people who have just exchanged something real, not large, not dramatic, not the kind of thing that would be visible to anyone watching from outside. Just two people briefly on the same side of the same truth. Then Alexander stood and picked up his coat and said in a voice that was entirely back to its usual register, "I'll have William review Miller's Road by Monday." "Thank you," she said. He paused at the door. "Miss Whitfield, the work you're doing, the survey, the mill, the tenant contracts." He said it without looking at her. "It matters. I want you to know that I know it matters." He left. Eleanor sat in the empty parlor for a long moment. Then she opened the writing table drawer, took out Clara's letter, and read it one more time. She put it back. She picked up her pen. There was still a great deal of work to do, and she had always been at her best when she was working, and she was beginning to understand in the slow and careful way she understood things that mattered, that the work itself was no longer the only thing in the room worth paying attention to. William Alcott's assessment arrived on a Monday. Eleanor read it standing at the writing table, because she hadn't wanted to sit down until she knew whether it was good news or bad, and she had learned long ago that bad news was easier to receive on your feet. It was good news. William had reviewed the 1802 survey, the 1809 survey, the original deed language for the Whitmore Eastern parcel, and the 3 letters exchanged between the elder Whitmore and Thomas Alcott's father in 1811. Letters that Alexander had located in a trunk in the hall's east storage room the previous Friday, after Eleanor had asked him with the careful precision she brought to requests. She considered important whether his father had ever communicated directly with the Alcotts about the creek boundary before the dispute became formal. He had, extensively, and the letters were unambiguous. William's letter concluded with a single sentence that Eleanor read 3 times. "The case for the Whitmore boundary claim is strong enough that I would be surprised if Thomas Alcott chose to contest it at hearing once the full documentation is presented." She set the letter down. She picked it up again. She was not a woman given to celebrating privately. Celebrations were for things that were finished, and this was not finished. But she allowed herself in the quiet of the empty study a single long breath that was partly relief and partly something that felt very close to satisfaction. Then she wrote to Alexander. She kept it brief. She told him William's assessment was favorable, that the documentation package was nearly complete, and that she would have a full written summary ready for his review by Wednesday. She did not tell him how she had felt reading William's conclusion. That was not part of the work. She folded the letter and gave it to Mrs. Holt to send. His reply came before supper. "Miss Whitfield, Wednesday is acceptable. I have a matter to raise that is separate from the survey. A. Whitmore." She read the note twice, trying to determine what the separate matter might be, and concluded she could not determine it from 4 words and an initial, and she was wasting time trying. She went back to work. The separate matter, as it turned out, had nothing to do with the accounts. Alexander arrived on Wednesday at 10 o'clock precisely, and Eleanor was ready with the summary 12 pages organized by document type cross-referenced with William's legal analysis and her own notes on the tenant contract implications. She handed it to him when he sat down, and he read it all 12 pages without speaking. She had learned to let him read. He was a thorough reader, and the thoroughness was not performance. He came back with specific questions always, which meant the reading was real. He came back with 4 questions this time. She answered 3 immediately. The 4th required her to check a secondary letter from 1811, which she retrieved, and the answer was there in the 2nd paragraph. "Good," he said when she pointed to it. "Yes," she agreed. He set the papers down. Then he said, "There's an assembly at the Morrison house Saturday evening." Eleanor looked up. "Margaret Morrison has decided to host it as a celebration of her son's return from Philadelphia." He continued in the tone of a man presenting facts in the order they needed to be presented. "The invitation list includes most of Richmond's established families. Thomas Alcott will be there, the Beauchamps, the Langleys." A pause. "Nathaniel Carter and Miss Beaumont have been invited." Eleanor kept her face still. "I see," she said. "I'd like you to attend with me." The room was very quiet. "As what capacity?" she asked. "As my guest." He met her eyes directly, publicly, without ambiguity. She understood what he was saying. Attending the Morrison assembly as Alexander Whitmore's guest was not the same as the professional arrangement they had built over the past 3 weeks. It was something the room would read differently, something Richmond would interpret with the full force of its collective attention and appetite for meaning. It was the kind of appearance that closed certain conversations and opened others. "Why?" she asked. "Because the hearing date has been set for the 4th of August, he said. "Thomas Alcott knows it. He knows the documentation is against him. And in my experience, men who know they're losing a legal argument find other ways to apply pressure." He paused. "Your position in this community is the most efficient point of pressure available to him. You think he'll go after my reputation. I think he's already started." His voice was even, but something underneath it was not. "I had a conversation with James Whitfield yesterday. Alcott has been suggesting to 3 separate parties that your involvement in my accounts is improper. Not professionally improper. Personally." The word landed in the room like a stone in still water. Eleanor sat very still. "He's implying," she said carefully, "that our arrangement is not professional." "Yes. And attending the assembly together publicly reframes the conversation entirely," Alexander said. "A man who brings a woman to a formal assembly as his acknowledged guest is not conducting anything improper. He's conducting a courtship, or what Richmond will read as one, and that reading protects you far more than the alternative." She looked at him. She was not certain whether she was moved or offended by the logic, and she suspected the honest answer was both, and she suspected he knew that. "You're proposing to court me," she said, "as a legal strategy." Something shifted in his expression. Barely visible. But she was learning to read him. She was learning him the way she had learned the ledgers, with close attention and a willingness to sit with what she didn't yet understand, and what she saw was not a man who found the question simple. "I'm proposing," he said, "that we allow Richmond to draw its own conclusions from an accurate set of facts." "What are the accurate facts, Mr. Whitmore?" A pause. Longer than his usual pauses. "That I respect you," he said. "That I value your work. That I find your company." He stopped, chose again. "Considerably more honest than most of what I encounter in that room." He looked at her steadily. "Those are accurate facts. What Richmond does with them is Richmond's business." Eleanor looked at her hands for a moment. "If I attend," she said, "I'm not attending as someone who needs your protection. I know that. I'm attending because I choose to." "I know that too." She looked up. "Saturday at 7. I'll call at 6:30. She spent Thursday and Friday working and not thinking about Saturday, which was a discipline she applied with the same focused attention she applied to everything else, and it worked approximately 60% of the time. The other 40% she spent thinking about what Margaret Alcott had said. "He's been contained, careful, the way men get when they've decided that caring about something is a liability they can't afford, and about the note he had sent her that first evening, and about the way he had said, "I'll admit I missed it," without padding the admission with anything unnecessary. She spent a portion of Friday afternoon thinking about the fact that she was thinking about these things and concluded that the thinking itself was information she needed to handle carefully. She was not. She told herself firmly in any making emotional decisions about a man she had known for 3 weeks, particularly when those 3 weeks had occurred in the direct aftermath of the worst public experience of her life. She was aware in the exact emotional condition that made intelligent women make unintelligent choices, and she intended to be smarter than that. She had always been smarter than that. She spent Friday evening rereading the survey documents. The Morrison house was already full when they arrived Saturday at 7:15. Eleanor had worn the green dress, not the ivory, which belonged to a different occasion and a different version of her future, and she had put her hair up without assistance, which she preferred because she had always believed that a woman who could manage her own presentation was a woman who understood her own resources. Alexander had said nothing about the dress when he called for her, except to offer his arm, which she took, and to say to her father, who had appeared in the hallway, with the expression of a man determined not to make anything of a moment that was clearly something, "Good evening, sir. I'll have her home by 10. Her father had nodded. Eleanor had not looked at either of them. They arrived and the room noticed. She felt it the way she had felt it at the Alcott gathering, the change in air, the shift of attention, the slight adjustment of conversations as people registered what they were seeing and began deciding what it meant. But it was different this time. At the Alcott gathering, she had arrived alone, armored entirely by her own resolve. Here she arrived with Alexander Whitmore's hand at her elbow, and the full weight of his social position arranged quietly and without announcement on her side. The difference was not lost on her. She did not permit herself to feel grateful for it. She permitted herself to acknowledge it, which was not the same thing. Margaret Morrison, a generous woman with a gift for hosting that expressed itself in the particular talent of making everyone feel they had been specifically invited, came to them immediately. "Eleanor, you look wonderful." She took Eleanor's hands and held them briefly. "Alexander, thank you for coming." Then, with the ease of a woman who managed social occasions, the way Eleanor managed accounts thoroughly without visible effort, she moved them both into the room, introduced them to 3 people in rapid succession, and disappeared. The first 20 minutes were navigation. Eleanor knew this kind of room. She had grown up in it, the careful choreography of Southern social gatherings, the way alliances declared themselves through proximity and conversations announced themselves through who was or wasn't present for them. She moved through it with Alexander at her left and her attention everywhere. The Beauchamps cordial, cautious, still deciding. The Langley sisters together as always, Frederick absent, which told her something. James Whitfield, a nod across the room that carried more communication than most sentences. Thomas Alcott, who was standing near the far window with 2 men she recognized as Richmond's secondary banking interests, and he was talking with the focused ease of a man conducting business at a party, which in Richmond was the only honest kind of business conducted anywhere. He saw Alexander. He saw Eleanor. He did not change his expression, which meant he had already decided what his expression would be when this moment came. She watched him excuse himself from the bankers and move in their direction. "He's coming over," she said quietly. "I see him." Alexander's voice was level. "Do you want me to?" "Stay exactly where you are." Alcott reached them in 30 seconds. He was a man of 55 who had conducted land disputes with the patient aggression of someone who believed time was always on his side, and he had a handshake that lasted slightly too long and a smile that arrived slightly too late to be natural. "Alexander," he shook hands. "Miss Whitfield." A pause that was precisely calibrated, long enough to be pointed, short enough to be deniable. "I understand you've been assisting with some of Alexander's estate matters." "I have," Eleanor said. "Quite the undertaking for," another calibrated pause, "someone in your current circumstances." The room around them had not stopped exactly, but several conversations had slowed. Eleanor looked at Thomas Alcott with the full, calm, entirely deliberate attention of a woman who has read every document pertaining to his boundary claim and knows exactly how thin his case is. "My circumstances," she said pleasantly, involve a fairly comprehensive review of your family's 1809 survey. I found it interesting reading. Alcott's smile did not move, but something behind it did. The survey is entirely standard. James Alcott is your cousin, she said. The room was very quiet now. Not silent. Richmond never went silent, but the particular quality of noise that means people have stopped producing it and started absorbing it. He conducted a survey that established a property line beneficial to your family's claim, using a baseline reference that contradicts the original 1802 survey by 14 feet. She kept her voice the same pleasant, even unhurried. That's not a standard discrepancy, Mr. Alcott. That's a documented one. The smile was entirely gone now. I don't think a social occasion is the appropriate venue. I agree completely, she said. August 4th will be the appropriate venue. She smiled at him. I look forward to it. Alcott looked at Alexander. Alexander looked back at him with the expression of a man who has nothing to add because everything necessary has already been said. Alcott left. The room exhaled. James Whitfield appeared at Eleanor's left elbow from approximately nowhere and said without preamble, I have never enjoyed a party as much as I am enjoying this one. The evening continued. Eleanor moved through it with the focused calm she had been cultivating for 3 weeks, the particular stillness of a woman who has decided that no room will move her faster or further than she intends to go. She spoke with Margaret Morrison about the fall assembly schedule. She discussed the textile market with a merchant from Fredericksburg who wanted to talk about Philadelphia prices. She accepted 2 glasses of lemonade and drank half of each. She was reaching for a third when she heard Clara's voice. It came from behind her low and directed at someone close, and Eleanor recognized it, the way you recognize a sound that has been embedded in your memory for 10 years. Involuntary, immediate physical. She turned. Clara was standing 8 feet away with Nathaniel at her side, and they had clearly just arrived because Clara still had the look of a woman oriented to a new room, cataloging exits and alliances, and where the conversation was concentrated. She was in pale yellow, which she wore well. She always wore everything well. Nathaniel saw Eleanor first. His face did exactly what Eleanor had expected it to do. It moved through 4 emotions in rapid succession: recognition, guilt, something that might have been relief and might have been hope, and then a careful, settled blankness that she recognized as the expression men wore when they had decided on the performance they intended to give. Eleanor, he said. She met his eyes. She had been thinking about this moment. She had not been able to entirely avoid thinking about it, and she had decided that she would give it exactly what it deserved, and not 1 syllable more. Nathaniel, she said. Clara had gone still. The 2 women looked at each other. 10 years of history between them spread out across the distance of 8 feet, and every choice that had been made in the months that led to Whitmore Hall. Ellie, Clara said. Her voice was careful. Not the voice from the ballroom, the prepared, gentle voice. This one was rawer, less managed. Clara. Eleanor held her gaze for a moment. Long enough. Then she looked back at the room. She felt Alexander close on her left, not touching her, not needing to simply present the way. He was always simply present, without announcement. Nathaniel moved first. I wanted to, he started. I don't think this is the moment, Eleanor said. Not unkindly, not warmly, the tone of a woman who is managing her own time. Enjoy the evening. She turned. She heard Nathaniel say very quietly to someone, possibly Clara, possibly himself, She's different. She kept walking. She was standing at the far end of the room, collecting herself with the focused attention she used for that specific purpose when Frederick Langley found her. She should have anticipated Frederick Langley. She had anticipated Thomas Alcott. She had anticipated Nathaniel and Clara. She had not anticipated Frederick Langley, which was her error, because Frederick Langley was the kind of man who arrived precisely where you had not prepared for him to be. He came with 2 other men she recognized as part of his social set. Younger, well-dressed, the particular combination of money and boredom that produced cruelty, the way stagnant water produced mosquitoes. Miss Whitfield. His smile had the quality of something sharpened for a specific purpose. Quite the entrance you made. Good evening, Mr. Langley. I understand you've been helping Alexander with his accounts. The word helping landed with the weight he intended it to carry. Very industrious. Thank you, she said pleasantly. One does wonder. He continued angling toward his audience of two, with the practiced ease of a man who has performed this particular maneuver many times before. How a woman manages to find so much time for another man's business when her own affairs are in such disarray. The two men with him made the sound that men make when they're supporting a joke they understand is cruel and have decided to support anyway. Eleanor looked at Frederick Langley. She thought about the boundary survey. She thought about the mill-gear ratio. She thought about 12 pages of documentation that had taken 3 weeks to build and would take 30 seconds to explain in terms that Frederick Langley would understand immediately and not enjoy. She thought about the night of the engagement celebration and the sound of his voice carrying across the ballroom and the 3 tears she had allowed herself in the carriage and then stopped. She said, "My affairs, Mr. Langley, are in considerably better order than yours." He blinked. "I beg your pardon." "The Langley tobacco accounts," she said. She kept her voice conversational, not loud, not aggressive, the tone of someone sharing factual information in a setting that has requested it. "Your harvest reports from the last 2 seasons show a 40% reduction in yield. I reviewed them in the context of the Eastern Parcel research, because your property abuts the Henderson boundary, which is adjacent to the Whitmore Ridge. The yield reduction isn't weather-related. The neighboring parcels show normal yield. It's soil management." She paused. "I noticed that your drainage channels haven't been rerouted since your father's tenure. That's an 18-year-old infrastructure on soil that required updated drainage management about a decade ago." The 2 men beside Frederick Langley had gone very quiet. Frederick himself had gone a particular shade of color that was not flattering. "I mention this," Eleanor said, "not as a criticism, but because it seemed relevant to my work, and because it occurred to me that a man in your position might find a competent agricultural consultant more useful than whatever he's been doing instead." She smiled at him. "But that's entirely your business, of course. Enjoy your evening." She walked away. She did not look back. She found Alexander near the center of the room in conversation with James Whitfield, and a man she didn't recognize, and she came to his side, and she was aware that her hands were not entirely steady, and she did not allow that to show. Alexander looked at her. One look. The look that had learned over 3 weeks to ask a complete question in the time it took to move his eyes. She gave the smallest shake of her head. "I'm all right." He returned to his conversation. She stood at his side and breathed evenly, and thought about soil drainage and survey baselines and the specific satisfaction of a woman who has done her homework. Whitfield said without breaking his conversation, "Langley looks like he swallowed something." "He may have done," Eleanor said. "Excuse me." She moved toward the terrace. The night air hit her the same way it had at Whitmore Hall 3 weeks ago. The same Virginia summer, thick and warm. The same honeysuckle pulling through from somewhere in the dark. She rested her hands on the railing and breathed. She heard the door behind her. "Langley," Alexander's voice. "His drainage channels," she said. 18 years no update." A pause. "You reviewed his property in context of the Ridge research. Adjacent parcels, yes." She kept looking at the dark lawn. "He came at me sideways. I came back directly. I noticed." He came to stand beside her. Not close enough for anything improper. Close enough to be deliberate. "Are you all right?" She started and stopped, because the honest answer was more complicated than she had space for at this exact moment, and he would know if she rounded it into something simpler. "Eleanor," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She turned her head. He was looking at the lawn, not at her, which made it easier to hear. "I want to tell you something," he said. "And I want to say it once clearly, so there's no confusion about what I mean." She waited. "What I said on Wednesday about Richmond drawing its own conclusions from accurate facts." He paused. "That was accurate, but it wasn't complete." The honeysuckle moved in the warm air. "Go on," she said. "I asked you to this assembly because your position needed protection, and I was in a position to provide it." That part was true. He turned to look at her now. His voice was entirely steady the way it always was, but she had learned to hear what lived under the steadiness, the thing that was controlled rather than absent. "It was also true that I wanted you here, that I have wanted your company specifically, for reasons that have nothing to do with the accounts." He stopped. "I wanted you to know that those are also accurate facts, so that you have the full set of them." Eleanor held very still. She thought about what Margaret had said. He's been contained, careful, the way men get when they've decided that caring about something is a liability. She thought about 8 years of being alone and still. She thought about a man who had walked across a ballroom to correct a wrong. He had no professional reason to correct for a woman he barely knew because it was the right thing to do. She thought about her own carefully maintained stillness. Her ledgers and her survey records and her 40% success rate at not thinking about Saturday evenings. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. "Alexander," he said. She looked at him. Alexander. She tried the weight of it, found it fit differently than she expected, not formal, not strange, just real. "I'm not in a position to, I don't know yet what I'm—" She stopped, breathed, tried again. "I've spent 3 weeks building something I can rely on after 11 months of relying on something that turned out to be entirely different from what I believed it was. I'm careful with what I rely on now." "Good," he said. She blinked. "Good. I wouldn't trust a woman who wasn't careful." He said it without irony. "I'm not asking for a decision, Eleanor. I'm giving you accurate information. What you do with it is yours." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the lawn. "I'll need more time," she said. "I know. And I'll continue to push back on your readings of the tenant contracts when I think you're wrong. I'd be disappointed if you didn't. And I need the survey hearing to go first. August 4th, he said. We'll deal with everything else after." She nodded. The door opened behind them, and the sound of the party spilled out voices and music, and the civilized noise of Richmond, managing itself. And Margaret Morrison's voice said from the doorway, "There you both are. James Whitfield is looking for you, Alexander. And Eleanor," a pause that was not quite a pause, "your father has sent word that he's hoping you'll be home by 10. "Of course," Eleanor said. She turned from the railing. She walked back into the room with her hands steady and her chin level and the full weight of the evening Alcott's retreating face. Langley's sudden education in soil drainage. Clara's raw voice, Nathaniel's quiet observation that she had changed, and Alexander's words sitting in the night air, arranged quietly inside her, the way she arranged everything carefully accurately, in the order it would need to be dealt with. She was not the woman who had walked into Whitmore Hall 3 weeks ago. She was not entirely sure yet who she was becoming instead. But she was beginning to understand that the becoming itself was not something to be afraid of. Richmond had come tonight expecting to watch her diminish. Richmond had miscalculated. The 4th of August arrived. The way important days always did quietly without ceremony, the morning looking no different from any other morning, except for the particular weight Eleanor carried from the moment she opened her eyes. She was dressed before 6. She sat at the writing table with the complete documentation package in front of her, 12 pages of her own analysis. William Alcott's formal legal assessment, the 1802 survey, the 1811 letters, and a 3-page summary she had written specifically for the hearing judge organized, so that the essential facts presented themselves in the first paragraph, and everything subsequent was confirmation rather than argument. She had learned from watching her father navigate Virginia's legal culture for 3 decades that judges appreciated when someone understood their time was limited and had structured accordingly. She read through it one final time. It was good work. She knew it was good work. She had known it for 2 weeks and had continued refining it anyway because good work and finished work were 2 different standards, and she intended to meet both. Mrs. Holt appeared in the doorway at 6:30 with tea and the expression of a woman who understood the gravity of the morning and was expressing her support through the only language she trusted completely. "Thank you, Mrs. Holt. You eat something before you go," Mrs. Holt said. "I don't care what it is, something." Eleanor ate half a piece of bread. Her father appeared at 7 dressed for the courthouse, and sat across from her and said nothing at all, which was the most useful thing he could have done. Alexander arrived at 7:30. He came in without the formal ceremony of a social call. He knocked. Mrs. Holt opened the door, and he was in the front hall with his hat in his hands before Eleanor had risen from her chair. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Ready," he said. "Yes," she said. They went. The Richmond County Courthouse was not a dramatic building. It was practical, solid, built with the particular architectural confidence of a structure that understood its own function and had no need to announce it. Eleanor had been inside it 3 times in her life, once at 14, when her father had settled a minor property boundary question, once at 19, when she had accompanied Margaret Alcott's husband, for reasons she had since forgotten, and once 6 years ago, when she had sat in the gallery during a neighbor's inheritance dispute and watched the judge move through testimony with the methodical patience of a man who had heard every version of every argument and was waiting for the one that was actually true. She was not in the gallery today. She sat at the table beside William Alcott, who had the composed, careful energy of a man who had prepared thoroughly and knew it, and she arranged the documents in the order they would be needed and waited. Alexander sat directly behind her. She did not turn around. She didn't need to. Thomas Alcott was at the opposite table with his solicitor, a man named Hartwell, who had a reputation for volume over precision, which Eleanor had noted when William had mentioned him 2 weeks prior and filed away as relevant. Hartwell argued loudly and expected the loudness to carry the argument. William argued quietly and expected the facts to do the same. She had already decided which approach she preferred, and she thought the judge, a man of 60 named Reeves, who had the eyes of someone who had stopped being impressed by performance somewhere around 1800, would agree. Alcott looked at her once across the room before the hearing opened. She looked back at him with the steady, untroubled attention of a woman who has read every document pertaining to his claim and is not concerned about what he looks like when he makes eye contact. He looked away first. Judge Reeves called the room to order at 8 o'clock. The first 40 minutes were procedural. The formal presentation of the competing claims, the identification of the documents, each party intended to enter into evidence the brief opening statements from Hartwell and William. Hartwell's was longer. Williams cited 4 specific legal precedents in the space of 90 seconds and then stopped. Eleanor watched Judge Reeves make a note after Williams' statement. Hartwell's had not produced a note. The first witness was the current surveyor engaged by the Whitmore estate, a man named Peters, who had rewalked the boundary at Eleanor's request in late July and produced a new survey using both the 1802 and 1809 baselines, documenting the 14-foot discrepancy with the precision of a man who understood he would be questioned about it under oath. Hartwell cross-examined Peters with the focused energy of a man trying to find a weakness he had not located in his own preparation. "I didn't find one." Eleanor had worked with Peters for 3 hours 2 weeks prior. She had anticipated every question Hartwell was now asking, and Peters had answered all of them then in her father's study, until the answers were accurate and complete and completely unshakable. She heard Alexander shift in the seat behind her. She allowed herself one small exhale. The second witness was the clerk who had recorded the 1809 survey in the county land records. He confirmed under Williams' careful questioning that James Alcott, the surveyor, had submitted the 1809 document on Thomas Alcott's behalf and had received payment directly from the Alcott family account. Hartwell objected to the payment record. Judge Reeves overruled him. Eleanor wrote nothing on her paper. She simply listened. Then William introduced the 1811 letters. The 1811 letters were the moment the hearing changed. Eleanor had known they would be. She had known it the first time she had read them in Alexander's storage room, with the dust of the trunk still on her hands, and the particular stillness of someone who has just found exactly what they were looking for. The letters between the elder Whitmore and Thomas Alcott's father were not dramatic. They were not accusations or confessions. They were the ordinary correspondence of 2 neighboring landowners discussing a boundary that both parties in 1811 had apparently agreed was defined by the 1802 survey. Thomas Alcott's father had written in his own hand on March the 7th, 1811, The creek boundary, as established by the Hartley Survey of 1802, remains the understood division of our respective eastern properties. I see no reason to revisit it. The 1809 survey, which the current Thomas Alcott was using as the basis for his claim, had been conducted after that letter was written by a man who shared the Alcott name, establishing a boundary that contradicted the one Thomas Alcott's own father had described as settled. Judge Reeves read the letter twice. Then he looked at Hartwell. Hartwell attempted to argue that the letter was not legally binding. Judge Reeves said with the particular dryness of a man who had been on the bench for 22 years, "It is, however, highly relevant, Mr. Hartwell." Thomas Alcott at the opposite table had stopped looking at the room and was looking at his hands. Eleanor kept her face still. William presented two more documents, both confirming the 1802 baseline, and then turned the table over to Hartwell's remaining argument, which lasted 27 minutes and contained a great deal of language about the good faith conduct of the Alcott family, and very little about the actual boundary evidence. Judge Reeves ruled at 10:30. He ruled in favor of the Whitmore claim on all points. He dismissed the 1809 survey as insufficient to establish a competing boundary claim given the documented prior agreement between the families. He noted with the specific language of a judge who wants his ruling understood by everyone in the room that commissioned surveys bearing a familial connection to the commissioning party would be examined with particular scrutiny in future proceedings before his court. That last sentence was directed at Thomas Alcott, and everyone in the room understood it, and Thomas Alcott's solicitor was already reaching for his papers before the judge had finished speaking. William Alcott closed his folder. Eleanor set down her pen. She became aware in the sudden quiet following the ruling that her hands were perfectly steady. She turned around. Alexander was looking at her. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The expression on his face said what it needed to say. Not triumph, not relief. Something quieter than either of those things. Something that looked, she thought, a great deal like recognition. Like a man looking at something he had been right about and finding the rightness more significant than the winning. "Good work," he said. "We should thank William," she said. "William thanks you," William said dryly from beside her, gathering his documents. William found the 1811 letters because someone told him exactly where to look. They were outside the courthouse, the summer heat hitting them immediately, the air thick with August, when Thomas Alcott came down the steps behind them. He stopped 3 feet away. Eleanor turned. Alcott was a man who had spent 30 years winning most of his arguments and had not fully prepared, she thought, for the specific experience of losing one in this particular way. Not to Alexander Whitmore, whom he might have accommodated as an opponent of equal standing, but to the documentation assembled by a woman he had dismissed as a social inconvenience. He looked at her. "This isn't finished," he said. His voice was controlled, but only just. "Mr. Alcott," Eleanor said. She kept her voice even. "Judge Reeves issued a ruling. The boundary is established. The water rights are settled. You have legal recourse if you believe the ruling was an error, and I'd encourage you to use it if that's your position." She paused. "But the documents say what they say. Your father knew where that boundary was. The letter he wrote confirms it. I'm sorry if that's not the outcome you expected." She meant the last sentence. Not as a performance of graciousness. She was not performing anything. She genuinely understood that Thomas Alcott had lived for years believing a version of this boundary dispute that his family had constructed, and that losing it was disorienting in the way that losing any long-held belief was disorienting. She did not feel sorry for the losing, but she felt briefly the human weight of it. Alcott looked at Alexander. "You brought her into this," he said. "I hired a competent professional," Alexander said. "What happened is a consequence of the documentation, not of who found it." Alcott turned and went back up the steps, and Eleanor watched him go, and then she turned away, because there was nothing more to watch. They were in Alexander's carriage, heading back toward Richmond, when she finally let herself feel it. Not triumph, she had been right about that. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter and harder to name. The particular feeling of a thing completed. Of work done to its full standard, and then done past it, just to be certain. She had started this 3 weeks ago at a kitchen table with a cold cup of tea and a set of survey documents she had not been asked to evaluate, and a mind that needed urgently something real to work on. And she had turned it into a legal ruling that settled a decades-old boundary dispute and established as clearly as anything could be established in a Richmond courtroom that Eleanor Whitfield's professional judgment was a thing to be taken seriously. She looked out the carriage window. "You're quiet," Alexander said. "I'm thinking." "About what?" She considered. "About what comes next," she said. "The tenant contracts still need restructuring. The mill gear adjustment should be confirmed once Josiah Hale completes the repair. And there's the question of the Miller's Road documentation for the Henderson boundary, which William said he'd review, but hasn't completed yet." Silence. "Eleanor," Alexander said. She looked at him. "The hearing is finished," he said. "For approximately 30 more minutes, nothing else is required of you." She held his gaze for a moment. Then slowly, something in her unlocked. Not dramatically. Not the way things unlocked in the stories Clara used to read aloud on summer porches with tears and declarations. Quietly. The way a long-held breath releases when you finally remember that breathing out is also allowed. "It was the letters," she said. "That's what won it. Not the survey analysis, not William's argument. Your father's letter. Which you found. Which was in a trunk in your storage room for 5 years. I know." His voice had a quality she had not heard in it before, something rougher than his usual evenness, the sound of a man sitting with something he hasn't fully processed. "My father wrote it in March of 1811. He died that October. I didn't go through the trunk until I didn't go through it." He stopped. "You asked me whether he had ever communicated with the Alcotts directly, and I looked because you asked, and it was there." Eleanor looked at him. "I'm glad I asked," she said. "So am I." He looked out the window, then back at her. "There's something I need to tell you, about what happens next." She waited. "The Henderson parcel," he said. "Nathaniel Carter's offer." Her hands stilled in her lap. "What about it?" He withdrew it. Alexander's voice was careful. She could hear him calibrating, making sure he had the full sequence before he delivered it. 3 days ago, I heard from James Whitfield this morning before the hearing. Carter pulled his offer on the Henderson parcel on the grounds that the Beaumont family credit line was compromised." She stared at him. "Compromised how?" "Robert Beaumont extended credit against his textile interests to back the land purchase. What he apparently didn't disclose to Carter was that the textile interests had already been significantly leveraged in a Philadelphia investment that went badly in the spring." He paused. The credit line he offered Carter was not, as it turned out, fully available to offer. Eleanor sat with this for a long moment. Clara's letter was in her drawer at home. "I don't know what Nathaniel and I are building. I know I am beginning to suspect I didn't think clearly enough about whether I wanted what I reached for." "Is Clara aware of her father's financial position?" she asked. "I don't know," Alexander said. "Whitfield didn't have that detail." She looked at her hands. This was not satisfaction. What she felt was not satisfaction at all, which surprised her because 3 weeks ago she would have expected to feel something cleaner when she heard that Nathaniel Carter's plans had fallen through. Instead, she felt the complicated, uncomfortable weight of being someone who understood that other people's disasters were not her victories. "She may be in a difficult position," Eleanor said quietly. Alexander was watching her. "Yes," he said. "She may be. I don't want that." She said it plainly because it was true, and because she had stopped somewhere in the past 3 weeks pretending things were simpler than they were. "I don't want Clara to suffer financially because of her father's decisions. Whatever she did, that's separate." "I know," Alexander said. "You're not surprised by that." "No," he said. "I'm not." He paused. "It's one of the things I've been paying attention to." The carriage moved through the summer heat, and she looked at the road ahead and thought about the letter in the drawer and what she intended to do about it. She answered Clara's letter that afternoon. She sat at the writing table with the survey documents cleared away, and the household quieter than usual. Her father was out. Mrs. Holt was in the kitchen, and she wrote carefully the way she did everything. She did not forgive Clara. Not yet. Forgiveness was a thing that required time, and she was not going to manufacture it before it was real, because she had spent 11 months building something on a foundation she believed was solid, and she intended going forward to only build on things that actually were. But she wrote honestly, which was the thing Clara had always valued about her, and which Eleanor decided to give her anyway. She wrote, "I received your letter, and I have read it several times. I'm not ready to say the things that would make this simple, because it isn't simple, and we both know that. What I can say is that I don't wish you harm. I don't wish Nathaniel harm. I wish you both the clarity to build something real, because real things hold, and the other kind doesn't. I found that out the hard way. I hope you don't have to." She read it back. Then she added, "If your father's situation is as difficult as I understand it to be, I hope you have people around you who can help. I mean this without condition." She sealed it. She gave it to Mrs. Holt to post. Then she sat for a moment in the quiet of the house and breathed. Alexander came the following morning. He arrived without announcement. Again, he had stopped sending cards, which Eleanor had not explicitly encouraged, but had not discouraged either, because the cards had always felt like a formality that neither of them particularly needed. Her father met him in the hall. Eleanor heard their voices low, brief, the comfortable exchange of two men who had arrived at a mutual understanding about something without having formally negotiated it, and then her father's footsteps going toward the back of the house. Alexander appeared in the doorway of the study. She was at the writing table with the tenant contract, restructuring the next item, the one she had told herself she would begin this morning. She had begun it. She looked up. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning." He crossed the chair across from her. He sat. He looked at the papers on the desk, and then at her. "I want to propose a change to our arrangement." She set down her pen. "What kind of change?" How was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man uncertain, the quiet of a man who is being precise. "The arrangement we have is professional," he said. "You consult on the accounts. You're compensated for the work. It's clear, and it's been effective, and I don't want to undermine any of that." He paused. "But I want to propose something that exists alongside it, not instead of it. Alongside." Eleanor looked at him. "You told me at the Morrison Assembly that you needed time," he said. "I told you I understood that. I meant it. I'm not retracting it." He met her eyes. "But I want to be clear about what I'm proposing so that there's no ambiguity in what I've said and what I mean." "Go on," she said. "I would like to court you. Properly. Openly. Not as a strategy, and not as a protection for your position in Richmond. Though I'll note that it does accomplish both of those things, and I won't pretend otherwise." A pause. "Because I want to. Because you are the most consistently honest, capable, and interesting person I have encountered in a very long time, and because the last 3 weeks have been—" He stopped, chose again. "The most genuinely engaged I have been with another person since my wife died." The room was completely still. Eleanor held his gaze. "You said she died 8 years ago," she said. "Yes." "And in 8 years you have not—" "No." She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at him. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to answer it the way you answer everything." "All right. Do you believe you're capable of—" She paused, looking for the right word, the accurate one, of being present, not managed, not arranged from a distance. Present. The question landed in the room between them, and she watched him take it in. Really take it in, not deflect it or route around it, but actually sit with it the way she had learned he sat with things that deserved sitting with. "I don't know," he said. She blinked. "I don't know," he said again. "I've been what Margaret said is probably accurate, contained, careful. I've kept myself at a distance from most things for a long time because it was easier than the alternative, and I told myself the work was enough." He looked at her steadily. "I can tell you that I want to try. I can tell you that the wanting is real. I cannot promise you with certainty that I'm capable of it because I haven't been tested at it for 8 years, and honesty requires me to say so." Eleanor was quiet. She thought about 11 months of believing she knew who someone was, and then watching a ballroom reveal something else entirely. She thought about 12 pages of documents and a 14-foot discrepancy, and a letter in a trunk that had been sitting unread for 5 years, and a man who had looked because she asked. She thought about the carriage ride back from the courthouse, and the way he had said for approximately 30 more minutes, "Nothing else is required of you," and the specific quality of that. The knowledge that she was working too hard, and the refusal to perform patience about it. "I appreciate the honesty," she said. "I know you do. I'm going to be difficult," she said. "Not deliberately, but I push back on things I think are wrong, and I don't stop working when someone needs me to stop for their own comfort, and I have a very limited tolerance for people who say one thing and mean another." "I know," he said. "You've known me for 3 weeks." "I know," he said again. "And I know you considerably better than I know most people I've known for years because you don't narrate yourself differently for different rooms." He paused. "Neither do I. I think that's relevant." She held his gaze for a long time. "All right," she said. Something in his expression shifted. The smallest movement. The structural suggestion of a man who has been holding something very carefully for a long time and has just been told he can put it down. "All right," he said. "The tenant contracts," she said, picking up her pen. "The tenant contracts," he agreed. He pulled his chair closer to the desk. They worked for 3 hours. They argued about the Carter Clause in the Northeastern Tenant Agreement. Eleanor thought the language was deliberately vague, in a way that benefited neither party and needed to be renegotiated entirely. Alexander thought revision was sufficient. She showed him 2 comparable agreements from neighboring estates. He conceded. Around noon, Mrs. Holt appeared with tea and the particular expression of a woman who had been holding her peace for several weeks and was managing it through increasingly elaborate baking. Eleanor accepted the tea. Alexander accepted a piece of bread with the gravity of a man who understood that Mrs. Holt's offerings were not optional. The afternoon moved. At 3 o'clock, Eleanor set down her pen and said, "My father is going to want to speak with you formally." "I know," Alexander said. "He's going to ask what your intentions are." "I intend to tell him." She looked at him. "You're not nervous?" "I'm somewhat nervous," he said. "I'm not going to let that be visible." She laughed. It surprised them both, the laugh which came out genuine and unguarded, the first real laugh she had produced in what felt like a very long time. Alexander looked at her with the expression of a man who has just seen something he intended to remember. "There," he said quietly. She shook her head. "Don't make a thing of it." "I'm not making a thing of it." He was almost smiling. "I'm noting it for personal reference." "That's the same thing." "It categorically is not." Her father appeared in the doorway. He looked at them both. The papers spread across the desk, the 2 untouched cups of tea, the very slight and deliberate distance they had maintained between them all morning. "Alexander," he said, "I wonder if you'd stay for dinner." Alexander looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at her father. "Stay for dinner, Mr. Whitmore," she said. "Alexander," he said. She picked up her pen. "Stay for dinner, Alexander." He stayed. After dinner, her father's venison, Mrs. Holt's bread, a conversation that moved from the hearing to the tenant contracts to Virginia's tobacco market in 1815, without any of the formal scaffolding that such evenings typically required. Her father and Alexander sat in the front parlor, and Eleanor gave them privacy because she understood what the conversation needed to be, and because she trusted both men to have it honestly. She sat in the kitchen with Mrs. Holt and drank the tea that the afternoon's work had left cold reheated now to something actually drinkable, and she listened to the low sound of the voices in the parlor without trying to make out the words. Mrs. Holt said after a long quiet, "He came 3 times last week." "I know. He reads the documents you give him before he gets here. I can tell from the questions he asks." "I know that too." "He told your father this morning." She stopped. Eleanor looked up. "What did he tell my father?" Mrs. Holt folded her hands in her lap. She was a woman who believed in the economy of words and was now deciding whether this was a moment that warranted spending some. "He told your father," she said carefully, "that he had not felt at ease with another person in a very long time, and that the ease surprised him." Eleanor looked at the table. She thought about the 4 words he had said to her once 2 years ago at a Henderson party. "Good evening, Miss Whitfield." And the wall behind them that she had registered even then, not as a warning, but as a fact. The way you register the weight of something before you know what you're going to do with it. She thought about what it cost a careful man to say he was surprised. She picked up her tea. "He's staying for dinner again Friday," Mrs. Holt said. It was not a question. Eleanor looked at her. "He hasn't been invited yet." "He'll be invited," Mrs. Holt said serenely, and rose to clear the cups. The parlor door opened at 8:30. Eleanor's father appeared first with the expression of a man who had conducted himself exactly as he had intended to, and was quietly satisfied with the outcome. He kissed her on the top of the head, which he had not done since she was about 14, and went upstairs. Alexander came to the kitchen doorway. "Your father," he said, "is a remarkable man." "He is," Eleanor agreed. "He asked me 3 questions." Only 3. They were very efficient questions. He leaned against the doorframe. He looked, she thought, marginally less contained than he had looked all day. Not undone, not unguarded, just slightly less armored. The particular appearance of a man who has said the things that needed to be said, and found that saying them did not in fact collapse anything. "What were the questions?" she asked. "He asked whether I understood what I was proposing," he said. "He asked whether I was proposing it for Eleanor's benefit or for mine, and he asked whether I would be the kind of man she could argue with." Eleanor looked at him. "What did you say?" "I said yes. I said mine honestly, but that I believed it would also benefit Eleanor if she chose to allow it. And I said—" He paused, and something moved in his expression that was not quite an almost smile, but was in the same neighborhood. That arguing with her was already one of the things I valued most about the arrangement. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. He approved. He said that was exactly the right answer, and he wanted the tenant contract restructuring completed before the end of September. She laughed again, shorter this time, quieter. The kind of laugh that belongs to people who have been through something real together and can finally breathe. Alexander looked at her with the expression she had first seen in the doorway of the parlor, and had been learning ever since the specific expression of a man who has been right about something important and finds the rightness more moving than he expected. "Friday," she said. "Friday," he agreed. "Dinner at 7. Bring the Millers Road documentation." "I'll bring the Millers Road documentation. And the revised Northeastern tenant clause. And that." He straightened from the doorframe. He picked up his hat. He was halfway to the front hall when he stopped and turned back, and his voice when he spoke was entirely even the way it always was. But she had learned by now to hear what lived underneath the evenness. "Eleanor," he said. "Alexander." "Thank you," he said. "For the letters, for the survey, for—" He stopped. "For all of it." She held his gaze. "You're welcome," she said. "For all of it." He left. She sat in the kitchen for a long moment with the empty teacup and the sound of Mrs. Holt moving somewhere at the back of the house, and the particular August quiet of a Virginia evening pressing warm against the windows. She was not who she had been on the morning of June the 14th. The woman who had pinned her hair and put on the ivory dress and gone to Whitmore Hall, expecting the beginning of one kind of life. She understood that woman. She did not dismiss her. She felt for her, the generous and honest compassion of someone who knows what it is to believe in something completely and have the belief revealed as incomplete. But she was not her. She was a woman who had walked into a courthouse that morning with 12 pages of documentation and walked out with a legal ruling. A woman who had answered an apology honestly rather than easily. A woman who had looked at a man who said, "I don't know if I'm capable of it," and understood that the not knowing said plainly was worth more than any certainty she could have been offered. She picked up her pen. The tenant contracts were not going to restructure themselves. She began to work. September came to Virginia the way it always did. Without apology, the heat finally beginning to relent by degrees, the mornings carrying the first suggestion of something cooler. Underneath the warmth, the light changing quality in a way that was difficult to name but impossible to miss. Eleanor noticed it on a Tuesday morning standing at the window of her father's study with a cup of tea that had gone cold in her hand while she worked through the final language of the Northeastern Tenant Clause. She noticed the light and thought with the clarity that came to her sometimes when she was between one thought and the next. It has been 11 weeks. 11 weeks since the ivory dress and the silver tray and 7 words that had silenced a ballroom. 11 weeks since the world she had been building had revealed itself as something different from what she had believed. She set down the cold tea. She picked up her pen. The Northeastern Tenant Clause was not going to wait for her to finish cataloging the passage of time. The tenant contract restructuring was completed on a Friday at 2:30 in the afternoon, when Eleanor set the last signed document in the completed stack, and Alexander looked at it and said without fanfare, "That's done." "That's done," she agreed. They had spent 6 weeks on it. 6 weeks of arguing over language and precedent, and the specific protections that Virginia tenant law did and did not provide, and of Eleanor pushing back on 3 separate clauses that Alexander's solicitor had drafted with the casual confidence of a man who assumed the clauses would never be tested, and of Alexander conceding 2 of the 3 and holding the 3rd until Eleanor demonstrated with the patience of a woman who understood that demonstration was more effective than assertion that she was right about that one too. He conceded the 3rd. The final contracts were, Eleanor believed, the most equitable tenant agreements in the Eastern Ridge District. She believed this not as a matter of pride, but as a matter of fact. The way she believed the 1802 survey was the authoritative document because the evidence supported it. "William wants a copy for his reference files," Alexander said. "I'll send one this afternoon." James Whitfield asked if you'd consult on his tobacco yield documentation. She looked up. "When did he ask?" "Yesterday. He sent a letter to the hall." He paused. "I told him I'd relay the request and that the decision was yours." She looked at him. "He's serious about the drainage channels," Alexander said. "He spoke to Josiah Hale after the mill repair and Hale confirmed the assessment." Whitfield said, a pause that contained, she thought, something close to amusement, that he had never before been educated about soil management at a dinner party by a woman he had just met, but that he intended to take the education seriously. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Then, tell him yes. I'll need to see his yield records from the last 3 seasons and the original drainage survey, if one exists." "I'll tell him." She began organizing the completed contracts into their proper order. Alexander did not move to leave, which she had learned to register. He left when the work was finished and there was nothing else to say. And when he didn't leave, it meant there was something else to say. She kept organizing. "There's a gathering at the Henderson house in 2 weeks, he said. She stopped. The Henderson house. The parcel that Nathaniel Carter had withdrawn his offer on. The parcel that now sat in limbo, the Henderson family, apparently undecided about whether to sell or lease or simply hold through the winter. "I know," she said. "Margaret Morrison will be there. The Whitfields, the merchant family, not yours. William." He paused. "Thomas Alcott has declined." "Has he? He's spending the autumn in Fredericksburg. Family matter, according to his housekeeper." The dryness in Alexander's voice was slight but present. "A remarkably convenient family matter." Eleanor allowed herself a small private satisfaction that she did not allow to show on her face. "And Nathaniel and Clara?" "Invited. Whether they attend is their decision." She finished organizing the contracts. She set them in a neat stack. She turned to face him properly. "Are you asking me to attend with you?" "Yes." "Publicly?" "Yes." He met her eyes. "As I've attended every gathering with you since the Morrison Assembly. As I intend to continue attending gatherings with you for the foreseeable future, with whatever implications Richmond chooses to draw from that." He paused. "Which I expect you know by now." She did know. Richmond had been drawing its implications steadily since July. Mrs. Beauchamp had stopped visiting with the expression of someone managing a social casualty, and started visiting with the expression of someone trying to secure a position in a narrative that was moving faster than she'd anticipated. The Langley sisters had been noticeably warmer. James Whitfield had stopped treating Eleanor like an interesting exception and started treating her like a professional, which was the more meaningful of the two changes. The story Richmond told about Eleanor Whitfield had shifted. Not because Eleanor had done anything to change it, or not directly. She had done her work. She had shown up. She had told the truth in a courthouse and at dinner tables and across writing desks, and Richmond, which was beneath all its performance, a community of people who ultimately respected the things that held up under examination, had adjusted its reading accordingly. 2 weeks, she said. 2 weeks, he agreed. The letter from Clara arrived the following Monday. Eleanor recognized it the moment Mrs. Holt put it on the desk. The handwriting had a different quality than the first letter, less controlled. The pen pressed harder, in places the evidence of someone writing faster than they usually allowed themselves to write. She opened it. Ellie, I don't know if you've heard. I suspect you have because Richmond hears everything, but I wanted you to hear it from me if possible. My father's Philadelphia investment failed completely in August. The credit line he extended to Nathaniel was recalled. He's been managing it. Or trying to. He's not a man who manages difficulty well, which I think you know better than I would like to admit. I didn't know when it mattered. The engagement is not what I thought it was. I don't know what it is now. I'm not writing to ask for sympathy. I'm writing because your letter said you didn't wish me harm, and I wanted to say that I believe you, and that it means more than I can properly express. I made a choice that I cannot unmake. I'm living in the consequences of it. I'm trying to be honest about that with myself, which is something I should have been a great deal sooner. You said you hoped I'd have people around me who could help. I find I have fewer of those than I thought. That's also a consequence, I suppose. I don't expect anything from you. I only wanted you to know that the woman you believed me to be your truest friend, the one you thought I was for 10 years, I am trying to find my way back to her. I don't know if I can. I thought you should know I'm trying. Clara Eleanor read it twice. She sat very still. She thought about 10 years. She thought about the dressmaker's shop and the borrowed shawls and the summer porches and the laugh that had been real even when everything that came after it wasn't. She thought about the hand laced through Nathaniel's fingers and the prepared voice in the ballroom and the 3 tears in the carriage that she had stopped at 3 because stopping was the thing she could control. She thought about what it meant to try to find your way back to yourself when you had walked a long distance from where you were. She knew something about that. She knew it differently than Clara knew it, from a different direction, a different damage, but she knew it. She picked up her pen. She wrote Clara. I've heard. I'm sorry for the difficulty, genuinely. I mean that without condition, as I said before. She stopped. She looked at what she had written. She wrote the next part more slowly. I cannot undo what happened between us, and I won't pretend that the friendship is where it was, because it isn't, and we'd both know if I said otherwise. But I believe that you are trying, because you have always been honest with me when honesty was hard, and this letter is honest. That matters to me. If you find yourself in need of practical assistance, not friendship, not yet, but practical, concrete assistance, you may write to me. I won't promise anything I cannot keep, but I won't close the door either. Eleanor. She sealed it and gave it to Mrs. Holt, and did not spend the rest of the day thinking about whether she had said the right thing, because she had said the true thing. And in her experience, those two were the same when you were paying sufficient attention. The Henderson gathering was on a Thursday evening in mid-September, and Eleanor wore the green dress again because it was the dress that had been present for things that mattered, and she had begun to think of it privately as the dress that belonged to the version of herself she was becoming, rather than the one she had been. They arrived together. The room was smaller than the Morrison assembly. The Hendersons kept an intimate house deliberately, which Eleanor had always appreciated, and the faces were largely familiar. Margaret Morrison, William Alcott, James Whitfield, who crossed to Eleanor within the first 5 minutes and said without preamble, I found the original drainage survey, 1798. You were right about the channels. I usually am, she said pleasantly. He laughed. God help us all, he said with the tone of a man who meant this as a compliment, and moved away. Alexander was beside her, and she felt rather than saw him almost smile. The evening moved. She talked. She listened. She tracked the room with the attention she brought to everything. Nathaniel Carter was there. She saw him before he saw her across the room, standing slightly apart from the main conversations, the posture of a man who has arrived somewhere he was not entirely certain he should have come. He looked smaller than she remembered. Not physically, he was the same height, the same build. But something in the way he occupied the room had contracted the ease she had always associated with him. The thrown-back laugh, the comfortable belonging was diminished as though the confidence had been on loan and the loan had been called. He saw her. He didn't move toward her immediately. He waited, which told her something had changed in him. The old Nathaniel would have moved immediately, would have trusted that his charm could manage any approach. This Nathaniel was calculating whether the approach was wise. She crossed to him. She did it deliberately because she refused to spend the evening managing the distance, and because she had decided somewhere between Clara's letter and the finished tenant contracts that she was done allowing other people's discomfort to become her choreography. "Nathaniel," she said. "Eleanor." His voice was quieter than she remembered. "You look—" He stopped. "You look well." "I am well," she said. And then, because she had decided on honesty, "How are you?" He looked at her. The look of a man trying to determine whether the question is a courtesy or a real one. "Honestly," he said. "I only ask honestly," she said. He exhaled. "Not particularly well," he said. "The Henderson purchase fell through. Some investments Clara's father made, it's complicated." He paused. "It's been a difficult few months." "I heard," she said. "I'm sorry for the difficulty." He stared at her. "You're sorry," he said. "Yes, Eleanor, He stopped. "I don't understand how you can—" "I'm not saying it was all right," she said. "What you did, what you both did, it wasn't all right, and I'm not revising that." Her voice was even. "But your financial situation being difficult is separate from what happened between us, and I'm not a person who finds satisfaction in other people's hardship. That's all." He was quiet for a long moment. "I made a mistake," he said. It came out simple and unadorned, without the performance of remorse she had expected. Just flat and clear and real. "I don't know if that word covers it, but I made a significant mistake and I think about it." He paused. "I think about the ring on the tray." "Don't," she said, not unkindly. "It's done. I put it on the tray and walked away, and that was the right decision. For both of us, I think, even though you weren't able to see it yet." He looked at her for a long time. "Alexander Whitmore," he said quietly, not as a question. "Yes," she said. "He's—" Nathaniel stopped. Something moved across his face that she could not entirely read. Not jealousy, not quite. Something more honest than jealousy. "He sees you," he said. "Doesn't he? The whole of you." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "He does." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "I didn't," he said. "I saw what I wanted to see. I didn't look for the rest." He looked at the floor for a moment. We're trying to figure out what we are. She's not—" He stopped again. "She's not the woman I thought she was either. Or maybe she is, and I didn't look at her clearly either. I don't know." "You should figure that out," Eleanor said. "Honestly, whatever the answer is." "Yes," he said. "I know." She left him standing there. Not cruelly, she left him the way you leave a conversation that has said what it needed to say and doesn't need more words added to it. She found Alexander near the window. He looked at her. "You crossed to him," he said. "Yes. Are you all right?" She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "I am." She paused. "He said you see me. The whole of me." Alexander was quiet. "He's right," he said. She looked at him. "I know," she said. It was Margaret Morrison who caused the moment that Richmond would discuss for the remainder of the year. She did it with the particular precision of a woman who had managed social occasions for 40 years and understood exactly what she was doing and precisely when to do it. She called the room to attention, a light tap of her glass. Nothing dramatic, and she said with the warmth of someone who has decided that warmth is the appropriate register for this specific moment, "I'd like to say something if I may." The room settled. "I have known Eleanor Whitfield since she was a child," Margaret said. "I have watched her grow into a woman of extraordinary capability and character. I watched her this summer face one of the most difficult public moments a young woman can face, and I watched her face it with more grace and intelligence than most people manage in their finest hour, let alone their hardest one." The room was very still. Eleanor held herself steady. "I have also watched—" Margaret's eyes moved briefly to Alexander. "A man who has been very careful for a very long time, make a series of decisions that suggest he has decided that careful has its limits." She raised her glass. "To Eleanor, who proved this summer that a person's worth is not decided by who chooses them, but by what they choose to become after they've been given every reason to give up." Glasses rose around the room. Eleanor felt the heat in her throat and refused to let it reach her eyes. Alexander beside her lifted his glass. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They were in the carriage afterward, the September night pressing cool against the windows for the first time, when Alexander said, "I have something to ask you." She turned from the window. He was looking at her with the expression she had first learned to read on a summer terrace, the specific expression of a man who has been holding something very carefully and has arrived at the moment where holding it is no longer the right decision. "I want to ask you formally," he said. "Not as a strategy, not as a protection for your social position, not as a continuation of the professional arrangement." He paused. "As the thing it actually is." Eleanor held very still. "I want to marry you," he said. "If you'll have me, knowing that you'll push back on everything I'm wrong about, which will be frequent. Knowing that you'll take on every difficult thing before you ask for help with it. Knowing that there will be mornings when you're at the writing table before 6, and evenings when the accounts matter more than the conversation." He looked at her steadily. "Knowing all of that, and wanting it anyway. Wanting you specifically as you actually are." The carriage moved through the dark Virginia road, and the cool September air, and the particular quiet of a night that had decided to hold its breath. Eleanor looked at him. She thought about the ivory dress and the silver tray. She thought about the survey records spread across a kitchen table and a cold cup of tea. She thought about 12 pages of documentation and a 14-foot discrepancy, and a man who had looked in a trunk because she asked. She thought about, "I don't know if I'm capable of it," said plainly without decoration, and the specific value of honesty offered without guarantee. She thought about the woman who had pinned her hair on the morning of June the 14th and believed she was walking toward one kind of beginning. She had been right. She had simply been wrong about which one. "Yes," she said, "just that." One word, clean and certain and completely her own. Something moved through his face, the same contained movement she had first seen in a front parlor 6 weeks ago. The movement of a man who has set something down that he had been carrying for a very long time. He reached across and took her hand and held it, and she let him, and neither of them said anything else, because nothing else was required. Richmond found out on a Sunday. By Monday, it was in every parlor. By Tuesday, James Whitfield had stopped by the house to offer his congratulations in person and to ask entirely without embarrassment whether Eleanor intended to continue consulting on property matters after the marriage, because his drainage situation was not going to resolve itself. "Yes," she told him. "I do." "Good," he said. "I'll send the 1798 survey over this week." Mrs. Holt received the news with the expression of a woman who had seen it coming for 8 weeks and was satisfied to have been right. She baked bread. She said nothing, which was its own complete form of eloquence. Eleanor's father shook Alexander's hand for a long time on the evening Alexander came to speak to him formally, and when he came to find Eleanor afterward, his eyes were bright in the way of a man who has been holding something emotional at arm's length and is choosing now to stop. "He's a good man," her father said. "I know," Eleanor said. "He knows what he's getting." "He does," she agreed. "I told him." Her father smiled. It was the smile she had seen exactly 4 times in her life, at her mother's grave, at the completion of the estate accounts, when she was 17 in the carriage on the night of Whitmore Hall, and now. The smile man whose love for his daughter has no adequate expression and has stopped looking for one. "Good girl," he said. On a Saturday morning in late September, Eleanor walked out to the eastern parcel boundary with Alexander beside her. Not for work, not for documentation, not to check the survey markers or review the creek line or examine the progress of the mill gear repair. Though they talked about all of those things because that was who they were and she had stopped apologizing for it. They walked the boundary because it was a clear September morning and the air had finally released the summer and the ridge was the color of something almost finished, and because Eleanor wanted to stand at the place where the work had begun and know that she had done it. She stood at the creek. She looked at the water moving over the stones, the particular sound of it steady and indifferent and entirely itself. The creek that had been the subject of a 14-foot disagreement for 5 years now. Settled, now simply a creek again, doing what creeks did regardless of what men put on paper about them. "You're thinking about the 1802 survey," Alexander said. "I'm thinking about the letters," she said. "Your father's letter." He was quiet. "He knew where the boundary was," she said. "He put it in writing. He understood it was important to document the truth, even when the truth felt settled and obvious, even when it seemed like the kind of thing that didn't need to be said." "Yes," Alexander said. "I think about that," she said. "The things we don't say because they feel obvious. The truths we don't write down because we assume they'll hold without being recorded." He looked at her. "Say it," he said. "Whatever you're actually saying." She turned to face him. "I'm saying that I love you," she said, plainly, without decoration. "I'm saying it now clearly so that it's on record, because I have learned this summer that the things worth having are worth documenting." He looked at her for a long moment. "Eleanor," he said. "Alexander, I love you." He said it the way he said everything directly, without padding, with the full weight of a man who does not say things he does not mean. "I have for some time. I wasn't certain I was going to be able to say it." "But you did," she said. "But I did." She looked at the creek. At the boundary marker Peters had set in July. At the Virginia Ridge going gold in the September light. She thought about the morning of June the 14th, and the woman who had believed she was walking toward one kind of life. She had been. She had just been walking toward it from the wrong direction, through the wrong door, with the wrong understanding of what she actually needed. What she needed had not been the man who chose her before she knew what choosing looked like. What she needed had been the chance to choose herself first, to stand in a ballroom and set a ring on a tray and say thank you for the truth and mean it, and then to sit at a kitchen table with cold tea and survey records and build something real out of the wreckage of the thing she'd thought she wanted. She had done that. She had built it, stone by stone, document by document, argument by argument, on the foundation of her own judgment and her own work and her own unflinching refusal to become the story other people needed her to be. And Alexander Whitmore, careful, honest, contained, and stubbornly unwilling to pretend, otherwise had walked alongside it and waited and told her accurate facts and let her reach her own conclusions. That was what love looked like, she understood now. Not the version she had believed in at 23, the one that announced itself at the right moment, in the right season, and felt like arriving somewhere already prepared for you. This version was harder and quieter and more real than that. It was two people who told each other the truth, even when the truth was complicated, who pushed back and conceded and tried again, who showed up with documents and cold tea and the specific kind of patience that was not patience at all, but something better: respect. She turned to Alexander. He was looking at her with the expression she had first learned in the doorway of her father's parlor, and had been reading more clearly every week since, the expression of a man who has found, against his own careful expectations, exactly what he did not know he was looking for. "Ready," she said. He offered his arm. "Ready," he said. She took it. They walked back across the ridge in the September morning, and Richmond could say whatever it wished about Eleanor Whitfield, because Richmond no longer held the pen. She did. She always had. She had simply needed one impossible night in a ballroom to remember it.